A crown stolen from the shadows. Caterina Esposito had spent years preparing to marry a man she did not love. But before she could walk down the aisle, she was taken by a man far more dangerous than the one at the altar. Enzo Costa's grip tightened around her waist. "You were never meant for him," he murmured. "And now you never will be." Chapter 1. The Reluctant Bride's Predicament. The silk of Caterina Esposito's wedding gown felt like a shroud against her skin. It was a masterpiece, ivory and cascading, adorned with lace that had been in the Bellini family for generations. Each stitch was a symbol of the impending union, a binding not of love, but of obligation. Caterina stared at her reflection. The woman staring back was a stranger pale, with haunted hazel eyes that belied the forced calm of her expression. The opulent room in the Bellini villa, usually a sanctuary of familiar comforts, now felt like a gilded cage. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens, the air thick with the scent of roses and the distant murmur of arriving guests. The wedding was to be a spectacle, a merging of two powerful families, the Espositos and the Bellinis, a carefully orchestrated alliance to solidify power and territory in the intricate dance of the underworld. Caterina had known this day would come, had been groomed for it since she was a child. Duty, honor, family, these were the cornerstones of her existence, drilled into her with the same rigor as her lessons in piano and etiquette. Her fingers traced the delicate embroidery on the bodice of her gown. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but it represented everything she was losing. Her freedom, her dreams, even the faint hope of finding a love that was not dictated by bloodlines and business deals. Marco Bellini, her betrothed, was suitable. He was handsome in a cold, detached way, powerful, and respected within their circles. But there was a hardness in his eyes, a cruel edge to his smile that sent shivers down her spine. He saw her as a possession, a trophy to further elevate his status. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie.
Caterina, cara?
It was her mother, Isabella, her voice laced with a mixture of pride and a subtle, almost imperceptible sadness. Isabella Esposito was a woman of formidable strength, the matriarch who held the family together with an iron will and a velvet glove. She entered the room, her own elegant gown a deep, rich burgundy, her silver hair swept up in a sophisticated chignon. "You look radiant," Isabella said, her eyes assessing Caterina with a critical, yet loving gaze. She reached out and adjusted a stray tendril of Caterina's dark, wavy hair. "Nervous?" Caterina managed a weak smile. "A little." It was an understatement of epic proportions. Her stomach was a knot of anxiety, her heart a trapped bird fluttering against her ribs. Isabella's hand lingered on Caterina's cheek, her touch surprisingly gentle. "This is a big step, Caterina. But it is the right one. For our family. For your future." "I know, Mama," Caterina replied, the words feeling hollow even to her own ears. She had repeated this mantra so many times, trying to convince herself, to bury the rebellious whispers of her heart that yearned for something more. "Marco is a good man," Isabella continued, though Caterina detected a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a fleeting shadow that she quickly masked. "He will provide for you, protect you." Protect. The word echoed in Caterina's mind. Protection came at a price she was about to pay with her life. She wondered if Marco would ever see beyond her name, beyond her role as a bridge between families. Would he ever see her? Another knock, this one more insistent. It was Alessandro, Caterina's older brother, the heir to the Esposito empire. He poked his head in, his expression a mixture of excitement and protectiveness. "Cara, it's time. Everyone is waiting." Alessandro, with his dark hair and intense gaze, was the epitome of the Esposito's strength. He had always been her protector, her confidant, the one person who understood the burdens of their world. But even he, bound by the same traditions, could not offer her an escape. Caterina took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing pulse. She looked at her mother, at her brother, their faces etched with the weight of expectation. This was her duty, her destiny. There was no turning back. As she walked towards the door, a strange calm settled over her, a numbness that shielded her from the overwhelming fear. She would play her part, fulfill her obligations. She would be the perfect bride, the perfect wife. But beneath the surface, a flicker of defiance remained, a tiny spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. The grand hall was a sea of faces, a blur of elegant gowns and tailored suits. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the hushed whispers of anticipation. Katerina felt 1,000 eyes on her as she walked down the aisle, her arm linked with Alessandro's. The ornate chapel, with its vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows, seemed to close in on her, the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down. She saw Marco at the altar, his expression smug, his eyes devoid of any warmth. He looked at her as if she were a prize he had won, a conquest to be displayed. The priest began the ceremony, his words echoing through the silent hall. Katerina felt detached, as if she were watching the scene unfold from a distance. Then, chaos erupted. A sudden crash, the shattering of glass, shouts and screams. The doors of the chapel burst open, and men stormed in, their faces masked, their weapons drawn. Panic surged through the crowd, guests scattering, diving for cover. Katerina froze, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her roughly away from the altar. She cried out, struggling against the grip, but it was too strong. Her eyes met those of her captor, and a jolt of fear, different from anything she had ever experienced, shot through her. He was tall, imposing, his face obscured by a dark scarf, but his eyes, they were piercing, intense, a stormy gray that seemed to see right through her. "Don't scream," he commanded, his voice a low, guttural growl that vibrated through her. He dragged her towards a side exit, the chaos of the chapel fading behind them. She saw Marco, his face contorted in rage, fighting his way through the panicked crowd, trying to reach her. But it was too late. Katerina was being pulled into the darkness, into a world she didn't understand, by a man she didn't know. As they burst out into the cool night air, she caught a glimpse of a black car waiting, its engine running. He shoved her inside, slamming the door shut. The car sped away, leaving the villa, the wedding, and her carefully constructed life behind. The man beside her pulled down his scarf, revealing a face that was both striking and dangerous. Sharp cheekbones, a strong jawline, and those intense gray eyes that now held a flicker of something else. Satisfaction? Triumph? "Who are you?" Katerina managed to ask, her voice trembling. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Enzo Costa," he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down her spine. "And you, Katerina Esposito, were never meant for him." And now, he tightened his hand over her arm, the fabric of the wedding dress no match for his hold. "You never will be." The car roared on, into a darkness more uncertain than she could have ever prepared for. Chapter 2. A Shadow's Embrace. The black car sliced through the night, the city lights blurring into streaks of color against the rain-slicked windows. Katerina sat pressed against the door, her wedding dress a crumpled, silken mess around her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of fear and confusion.
Enzo Costa.
The name resonated with a dangerous power, a name whispered in hushed tones within her family circles. The Costas were rivals, enemies, a force to be reckoned with. She stole glances at him, his profile stark and unyielding in the dim light. He drove with a focused intensity, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. He was a predator, confident and in control, and she was his prey, caught in a trap she didn't understand. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice stronger than she expected, a thread of defiance woven into the fear. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the low hum of the engine. Finally, he spoke, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Somewhere safe," he said, the words sounding more like a threat than a reassurance. Somewhere he can't reach you.
Marco?
She asked, the name tasting like ash in her mouth.
Why?
What is this about? He glanced at her, his gray eyes piercing in the darkness. This isn't about Marco Bellini. This is about something much bigger. Something you're not yet ready to understand. His words were cryptic, unsettling. She wanted to demand answers, to scream and fight, but a primal instinct told her to be cautious, to observe. This man was dangerous, volatile, and she was completely at his mercy. The city gave way to winding country roads, the darkness deepening, the rain intensifying. Katerina felt a growing sense of isolation, as if she were being pulled further and further away from everything she knew, everything that was familiar. The grand villa, the wedding, her family, it all felt like a distant dream, a life that belonged to someone else. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the chill that had seeped into her bones. The silk of her dress, once a symbol of elegance and promise, now felt like a cold, suffocating weight. She longed for the comfort of her own clothes, for the familiar scent of her own home. Enzo finally pulled the car to a stop in front of a large, imposing house, shrouded in darkness. It was old, built of stone, with tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch her with silent disapproval. The rain lashed against the walls, the wind howling through the trees, creating an atmosphere of foreboding. "Get out," he commanded, his voice sharp. Katerina hesitated, her fear battling with a growing sense of defiance. She was not a child to be ordered around, but the look in his eyes, the cold, hard glint of steel, made her obey. She stepped out into the rain, the cold water soaking through her dress, plastering it to her skin. He led her towards the house, his hand gripping her arm, not roughly, but firmly, a constant reminder of her captivity. The interior of the house was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of old wood, and something else, something indefinable, a hint of danger and secrets. The furniture was heavy, dark, and antique, the walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced men and women who seemed to stare down at her with judgment. He led her through a long, echoing hallway and into a large room, a study perhaps, with a fireplace at one end, where a fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The warmth was welcome, a stark contrast to the coldness of the night and the chill that had settled deep within her. "Stay here," he said, his voice less harsh, almost neutral. "I'll be back." He left, closing the door behind him, leaving her alone in the strange, unsettling room. Katerina sank into a large, leather armchair near the fire, her body trembling, her mind racing. She was trapped, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. But she was also Katerina Esposito, and she would not be broken. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning the details, searching for any clue, any hint of what was to come. The walls were lined with books, their leather spines worn with age. A large desk sat in one corner, covered with papers and a vintage, ornate telephone. A half-finished chess game sat on a table near the window, the pieces exquisitely carved, the positions suggesting a complex, strategic battle. She thought of her family, of her mother and Alessandro. They must be frantic, searching for her, consumed with worry. The thought of their pain fueled a flicker of anger within her, a spark of resistance against her captor. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her racing heart, to find some semblance of control in the chaos. She needed to be strong, to be smart. She needed to survive. A sound startled her, the soft click of the door opening. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. Enzo stood there, his expression unreadable. He held a bundle of clothes in his arms. "Change," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You'll be more comfortable." He tossed the clothes onto the chair beside her and turned to leave. "Wait," Katerina said, her voice finding its strength. "I deserve an explanation. I deserve to know why I'm here." He paused, his back to her, his shoulders tense. He turned slowly, his gray eyes meeting hers, a flicker of something unidentifiable in their depths. "You will know everything in time," he said, his voice low and measured. "But for now, trust me when I say this is for your own good." And his. He nodded his head in the general direction from whence they came. Marco Bellini is not the man you think he is. And this wedding, it was a mistake. A dangerous mistake. He left, closing the door behind him, leaving Katerina with more questions than answers, with a growing sense of unease and a flicker of something else strange, unsettling curiosity about the man who had stolen her from her wedding, the man who now held her fate in his hands. The fire crackled, consuming the logs slowly, like time was consuming her old life. She was no longer certain of anything. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Costa Legacy. The clothes Enzo had provided were simple but comfortable: soft cotton trousers, a warm, woolen sweater, and thick socks. They were clearly not new, bearing the faint scent of his cologne, a mixture of cedarwood and something subtly spicy. Katerina changed quickly, grateful for the warmth and the relief from the sodden wedding dress, which now lay in a crumpled heap on the floor, a stark reminder of the life she had left behind. As she dressed, she examined the room more closely. It was definitely a study, a masculine space filled with the weight of history and secrets. The books lining the walls were in various languages: Italian, English, French, and even some in Latin. Titles ranged from classic literature to histories of powerful families, treatises on strategy and warfare, and even a few volumes on art and philosophy. She picked up one of the books, a worn copy of Machiavelli's The Prince, and flipped through its pages. The margins were filled with handwritten notes, in a bold, decisive script that she suspected was Enzo's. It was a book about power, about strategy, about the ruthless decisions required to maintain control. The chess game on the table caught her attention again. She studied the positions of the pieces, recognizing the complexity of the game, the intricate dance of attack and defense. It was a game of patience, of foresight, of anticipating your opponent's moves. It was a game that mirrored the world she had been thrust into, a world of hidden alliances, deadly rivalries, and carefully calculated risks. She heard a soft knock on the door, and Enzo entered, carrying a tray with 2 steaming bowls of soup and a loaf of crusty bread. The aroma filled the room, a comforting, savory scent that made her stomach rumble. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He placed the tray on a small table near the fire. Katerina hesitated, unsure whether to trust him, whether to accept his offering. But her hunger, and a growing sense of pragmatism, overruled her fear. She sat down opposite him, and they ate in silence for few moments, the only sounds the crackling fire and the clinking of spoons against the bowls. The soup was simple, a hearty minestrone filled with vegetables and pasta, but it was delicious, warming her from the inside out. It was a taste of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. "This is good," she said, breaking the silence, surprised by the calmness in her own voice. He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "My grandmother's recipe," he said. "She taught me how to cook." It was a small detail, a glimpse into his personal life, but it was unexpected, humanizing. It made her wonder about the man behind the mask of the ruthless captor, about the life he led beyond the world of power and violence. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked again, her voice softer this time, less accusatory. "Why did you stop the wedding?" He sighed, putting down his spoon, his gaze meeting hers. "The Bellinis are not who they seem, Katerina," he said, his voice serious. "They are involved in things, dangerous things. Things that would have put you in harm's way." "What things?" she pressed, her curiosity piqued. He hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "They are involved in trafficking. Drugs, weapons, even people." The wedding was a way to consolidate their power, to expand their reach. Katerina felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that the families operated in the shadows, that there were whispers of illegal activities, but she had never been exposed to the details, had always been shielded from the darker side of their world. "And you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you any different?" He looked at her, his gray eyes intense, unyielding. "We are different," he said, his voice firm. "The Costas have a code. We have rules. We don't deal in things that destroy lives. We protect our own." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they only raised more questions. What was their code? What were their rules? And who were their own? Did she now belong to that category? My family, the Espositos, are they involved? She asked, dreading the answer. He paused, his expression softening slightly. Your father, he tried to stay clean, he said, his voice choosing its words delicately. He tried to keep the Espositos out of the worst of it. But the Bellinis, they have influence. They have power. They were pressing him. Katerina felt a wave of sadness, a mixture of grief and anger. She had always admired her father, had seen him as a strong, honorable man. But she also knew that he was trapped, bound by the traditions and obligations of their world. And Alessandro? She asked, her voice trembling. My brother, is he? Enzo's expression shifted, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Respect? Regret? Alessandro is ambitious, he said, his voice carefully neutral. He sees the Bellinis as an opportunity. He is willing to overlook certain things to gain power. Katerina felt a knot of betrayal tighten in her chest. Alessandro, her protector, her confidant, was he complicit in the darkness? Was he willing to sacrifice her for his own ambition? So you took me to protect me? She asked, the question sounding almost absurd, given the circumstances. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. To protect you. And to stop the Bellinis. This wedding, it would have given them too much power. It would have upset the balance. The balance. It was a word that resonated with the unspoken laws of their world, the delicate equilibrium between the families, the constant struggle for dominance. And what now? She asked, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and a growing sense of determination. What happens to me? He leaned forward, his gray eyes holding hers captive. You stay here, he said, his voice low and firm. You stay with me. Until it's safe. Until I can figure out what to do. His words were both a promise and a threat. She was his prisoner, but also, perhaps, his responsibility. She was trapped in his world, a world of secrets and danger, but also, possibly, a world where she could find a different kind of freedom, a different kind of truth. The whispers of the Costa legacy, once ominous, now held a strange allure, a dark promise of a future she couldn't yet comprehend. She finished the soup, feeling strangely at peace with the uncertainty, at peace, even, with him. Chapter 4. The Unveiling of Old Wounds. The days that followed settled into a strange, unsettling routine. Katerina remained confined to the Costa house, a gilded cage of sorts, but with a degree of freedom within its walls. Enzo was often absent, disappearing for hours, sometimes days, leaving her in the care of a taciturn housekeeper named Rosa, a woman of few words but surprisingly kind eyes. Rosa, with her weathered face and silver-streaked hair, was a stark contrast to the opulence of the house. She moved with a quiet efficiency, preparing meals, cleaning, and tending to the needs of the household without complaint. She spoke little, but her presence was a comforting constant, a grounding force in Katerina's uncertain world. Katerina spent her time exploring the house, delving into the library, losing herself in the pages of books, trying to piece together the history of the Costas, the intricacies of their world. She discovered a hidden garden, overgrown and wild, but with a beauty that resonated with her own sense of untamed spirit. She spent hours there, tending to the neglected plants, finding a solace in the quiet solitude. She also observed Enzo when he was present. He was a man of contradictions, a complex tapestry of ruthlessness and unexpected tenderness. She saw the hardness in his eyes, the steel in his resolve, the weight of responsibility he carried on his shoulders. But she also saw glimpses of vulnerability, of a deep-seated sadness that hinted at a past filled with pain. One evening, she found him in the study, staring into the fire, his expression troubled. He was dressed casually, in jeans and a dark sweater, looking younger, less imposing than he had on the night of her abduction. "Enzo?" she said softly, her voice hesitant. He turned, his gray eyes meeting hers, a flicker of surprise in their depths. He hadn't heard her enter. "Katerina," he said, his voice neutral, devoid of any emotion. She approached him cautiously, standing near the fire, the warmth radiating against her skin. "You seem troubled," she said, her voice filled with a genuine concern that surprised even herself. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, his expression weary. "There are complications," he said, his voice vague. "Things are not as simple as I had hoped." She sensed that he was referring to the ongoing conflict with the Bellinis, to the repercussions of her abduction. She wanted to ask him about it, to understand the details, but she also sensed that he was not yet ready to share. "Can I help?" she asked, the question surprising even herself. He looked at her, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "You? What could you possibly do?" She met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "I'm not as helpless as you think," she said, her voice firm. "I know this world. I grew up in it. I may not be a warrior, but I have my own strengths." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "What strengths are those, Katerina?"
I'm observant, she said. I'm intelligent.
"And I understand people. I can read them, see their motivations, their weaknesses." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism in his gaze. "And what have you read about me, Katerina?" She hesitated, her heart beating faster. This was dangerous territory, a step into the unknown. But she had come this far, and she would not back down. "I see a man who is burdened," she said, her voice soft but steady. "A man who carries a heavy weight on his shoulders. A man who is lonely." His expression shifted, a flicker of surprise, followed by a hardening of his features. He turned away, staring back into the fire, his silence a palpable barrier. "You know nothing about me, Katerina," he said, his voice cold, dismissive. She felt a sting of rejection, but she refused to be deterred. "Then tell me," she said, her voice pleading. "Tell me about your past. Tell me about the wounds that you carry." He remained silent for a long moment, the tension in the room thick and heavy. Then, he slowly turned back to her, his gray eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "My father, he was killed when I was young," he said, his voice raw, almost a whisper.
He was betrayed.
"By someone he trusted." Katerina felt a wave of empathy wash over her. She understood betrayal, the pain of loss, the scars that remained long after the wounds had healed. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice filled with genuine compassion. He nodded, his gaze distant, lost in the memories of his past. "It changed me," he said. "It made me who I am." "It made you strong," she said, her voice firm. "It made you a survivor." He looked at her, a flicker of something unidentifiable in his eyes. Appreciation? Respect? Perhaps even a hint of attraction? "And you, Katerina?" he asked, his voice softer now, less guarded. "What about your wounds? What has made you who you are?" She hesitated, her own past rising up to meet her, the memories of a life lived in the shadows, of expectations and obligations, of a heart that had been stifled, suppressed. "I've always felt trapped," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Trapped by my family, by my duty, by the expectations of this world." "And now?" he asked, his gaze intense, probing. She looked at him, her eyes meeting his, a spark of defiance flickering within her. "Now I'm not so sure," she said, her voice stronger. "Perhaps this is my chance to break free, to find my own path." He smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. "Perhaps it is, Katerina," he said, his voice low and resonant. "Perhaps we both are." The moment hung between them, charged with an unspoken tension, a connection that was both dangerous and exhilarating. The unveiling of old wounds had created a bridge between them, a shared understanding that transcended their roles as captor and captive. It was a fragile bridge, built on pain and vulnerability, but it was a start. The fire crackled, the only witness to the unspoken promises, to the shifting dynamics of their relationship. She felt a pull towards him, a magnetic force she could not deny, nor did she want to. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Forbidden Past. The shared vulnerability of the previous night lingered in the air, creating a subtle shift in the dynamic between Katerina and Enzo. The invisible wall between them had not crumbled entirely, but cracks had appeared, allowing glimpses of understanding and a nascent, fragile connection. Enzo, though still guarded, seemed less distant, his gaze lingering on Katerina a fraction longer, his voice holding a softer edge when he spoke to her. He began to include her in small ways, asking her opinion on matters related to the household, sharing snippets of information about the ongoing conflict with the Bellinis, treating her less like a prisoner and more like a confidant. One afternoon, he found her in the hidden garden, her hands covered in dirt, her face flushed with exertion. She had been working tirelessly, clearing away weeds, pruning overgrown bushes, bringing a sense of order and beauty back to the neglected space. "You have a green thumb," he observed, his voice surprisingly gentle. Katerina looked up, startled by his presence. She wiped her hands on her trousers, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "It's therapeutic," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "It helps me clear my head." He nodded, his gaze sweeping over the garden, taking in the transformation she had wrought. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice sincere. "You've brought it back to life." She smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that reached her eyes.
"It was hidden," she said.
"Forgotten. Like so many things in this house." He understood the unspoken meaning behind her words, the parallel she was drawing between the garden and her own life, between the hidden beauty that lay dormant, waiting to be rediscovered. "This house, it holds a lot of memories," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "Some good, some not so good." "Tell me about it," she said, her voice inviting, encouraging. He hesitated, then sat down on a weathered stone bench, his gaze distant, lost in the echoes of the past. "My mother, she loved this garden," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "She spent hours here, tending to the flowers, finding peace in the quiet solitude." Katerina sat down beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his body, but not touching. She listened intently, her heart aching for the young boy he had been, the boy who had lost his mother, his father, his innocence. "She was different," he continued. "She didn't belong in this world. She was too gentle, too kind. She hated the violence, the darkness." Katerina sensed that he was talking about more than just his mother. He was talking about himself, about the conflict that raged within him, the struggle between the ruthless man he had become and the gentler soul that he kept hidden. "And your father?" she asked softly. His expression hardened, his jaw clenching. "He was a powerful man," he said, his voice tight. "Respected, feared. But he was also flawed. He made mistakes. Mistakes that cost him his life." "The betrayal," Katerina said, remembering his words from the previous night. He nodded, his gaze dark and brooding. "He trusted the wrong person. He let his guard down. And he paid the price." "And you vowed to avenge him?" she asked, her voice filled with understanding. He looked at her, his gray eyes intense, unyielding. "I vowed to protect what was left," he said. "To protect our family, our legacy. To make sure that what happened to him never happens again." She saw the burden he carried, the weight of responsibility, the constant vigilance. She also saw the loneliness, the isolation, the yearning for something more. "It's a heavy burden," she said, her voice filled with compassion. He nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips.
"But it's my burden," he said.
"It's who I am."
"Is it?"
she asked, her voice challenging. "Or is it who you think you have to be?" He looked at her, surprised by her boldness, by her insight. He didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. "There's more to you, Enzo," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I see it. I feel it. Don't let the past define you. Don't let it consume you." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, almost touching, but not quite. The air between them crackled with an unspoken tension, a magnetic pull that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "And what about you, Katerina?" he asked, his voice low and husky. "Are you letting the past define you?" She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm trying not to," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm trying to find my own way." to break free from the expectations, from the shadows. He withdrew his hand, the moment broken, but the connection remained, stronger than ever. "We're more alike than you think," he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. She nodded, her eyes locked with his.
"Perhaps we are," she said.
The forbidden past, with its echoes of betrayal and loss, had brought them together, forging a bond that defied the boundaries of their circumstances. It was a bond built on shared pain, on mutual understanding, and on a growing, undeniable attraction. The garden, once a symbol of hidden beauty, now represented the blossoming of a forbidden love, a love that was both dangerous and inevitable. The silence held no fear now, only the quiet promise of something more. She knew that the future remained uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. She had found a strength within herself, a resilience she never knew she possessed. And she had found something else, a connection with a man who was both her captor and her something she couldn't quite name, but felt deeply nonetheless. Chapter 6. A glimmer of unforeseen hope. The tentative understanding between Katerina and Enzo blossomed into something deeper, a fragile trust woven with a growing, undeniable attraction. They spent more time together, sharing meals, talking late into the night, discovering hidden facets of each other's personalities, finding solace and companionship in their shared isolation. Enzo, though still guarded, revealed a side of himself that Katerina had only glimpsed before. He was intelligent, witty, and surprisingly passionate about art and music. He showed her his collection of antique books, his love for classical music, his surprising skill at playing the piano. He even taught her a few basic chess moves, patiently explaining the strategies, his hand occasionally brushing hers, sending shivers down her spine. Katerina, in turn, shared her own passions, her love for literature, her dreams of traveling the world, her desire to make a difference, to leave a mark on the world that was not defined by her family name or her marital status. She told him about her childhood, about her close relationship with her father, about the stifling expectations of her mother and the ambitions of her brother. One evening, they found themselves in the drawing room, a grand, opulent space that was rarely used. Enzo had lit a fire in the fireplace, casting a warm, inviting glow on the room. He was sitting at the grand piano, his fingers effortlessly gliding over the keys, playing a hauntingly beautiful melody that resonated with Katerina's soul. She sat on a nearby sofa, listening intently, her heart captivated by the music, by the man who created it. She had never seen him so relaxed, so free. The music seemed to unleash something within him, a passion, a vulnerability that he kept carefully hidden. When he finished playing, he turned to her, his gray eyes soft, almost luminous in the firelight. "That was beautiful," she said, her voice filled with genuine emotion. "What was it?" "It's a piece by Chopin," he said, his voice slightly husky. "Nocturne in E-flat major. My mother used to play it." The mention of his mother brought a flicker of sadness to his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a warmth, a tenderness, that was directed at Katerina. "You have a gift," she said, her voice sincere. "You should play more often." He smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but it was enough to make her heart skip a beat. "I used to," he said. "Before everything changed." She understood. Before the death of his father, before the burden of responsibility, before the darkness had consumed him. "Perhaps you can start again," she said, her voice hopeful. "Perhaps I can help you find that part of yourself again." He looked at her, his gaze intense, probing. "And what about you, Katerina?" he asked. "What will help you find your way?" She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know yet," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I feel different here. With you. I feel like I can be myself. Like I don't have to pretend." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "You don't have to pretend with me, Katerina," he said, his voice low and resonant. "You can be whoever you want to be." His words were a promise, an invitation, a liberation. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the warmth of his hand against her skin, the closeness of his presence. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I never intended to fall for you, Katerina," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. The words hung in the air, a confession that both thrilled and terrified her. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze, her heart overflowing with a mixture of fear and desire. "And I never intended to fall for you, Enzo," she whispered back, her voice equally raw. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, hesitant touch that sent a wave of heat through her body. She responded, her lips parting slightly, inviting him in. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent, a release of pent-up emotions, a culmination of the unspoken tension that had been building between them. It was a kiss that spoke of forbidden desire, of shared vulnerability, of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. But as quickly as it began, it ended. Enzo pulled away, his breath ragged, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of desire and regret. "This is wrong," he said, his voice strained. "We can't." Katerina felt a pang of disappointment, a sharp ache in her chest. She knew he was right. Their situation was complicated, dangerous. Their families were enemies. Their love was forbidden. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "but it doesn't feel wrong." He looked at her, his gaze searching, questioning. He didn't say anything, but his eyes spoke volumes. He was torn, conflicted, struggling between his duty, his responsibility, and the undeniable pull of his heart. A sudden, sharp sound broke the silence, shattering the fragile intimacy. It was the ringing of the telephone in the study. Enzo's expression changed instantly, his features hardening, his eyes turning cold. He stood up, his body tense. "I have to take this," he said, his voice curt. He left the room, leaving Katerina alone, her heart pounding, her mind racing. The kiss, the confession, the forbidden love, it all felt like a distant dream, a fragile bubble that had been burst by the harsh reality of their world. The unforeseen hope that had glimmered so brightly just moments before now seemed to flicker and dim, threatened by the shadows that surrounded them. She felt a chill, a premonition of something dark, something dangerous on the horizon. She didn't know what the phone call meant, but she knew, instinctively, that it would change everything. Chapter 7. The Serpent's Kiss. Enzo returned to the drawing room, his face a mask of grim determination, his eyes devoid of the warmth they had held just moments before. The transformation was stark, unsettling, a reminder of the dangerous world he inhabited, the world that constantly threatened to pull him away from her.
"What is it?"
Katerina asked, her voice filled with apprehension. He hesitated, his gaze meeting hers, a flicker of regret in their depths. "It's Alessandro," he said, his voice tight. "He knows you're here." Katerina felt a chill run down her spine. Her brother. The one person she had trusted, the one person who had always been her protector. Now, he was the enemy, the one who threatened her newfound freedom, her fragile happiness.
"How?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He has sources," Enzo said, his voice vague.
"He's been tracking me."
"He knows about us." The word "us" hung in the air, a fragile, unspoken promise that was now threatened by the reality of their situation. "What does he want?" she asked, her heart pounding in her chest. Enzo's expression hardened. "He wants you back," he said, his voice cold. "He wants to renegotiate the terms of your arrangement." Katerina felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness towards the life she had begun to build here, towards the connection she had forged with Enzo. "I'm not going back," she said, her voice firm, defiant. "I won't be a pawn in their game any longer." Enzo looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "I won't let him take you," he said, his voice equally firm. "I'll protect you, Katerina. I promise you that." His words were reassuring, but she also knew the danger, the risk. Alessandro was ruthless, ambitious, and he would not give up easily. "He's coming here," Enzo said, his voice grim. "He wants to talk." Katerina felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. A confrontation. A battle of wills. A clash between two worlds.
When?
She asked.
Tomorrow, he said.
He'll be here at sunset. The setting sun. A symbolic time, a time of endings and beginnings. A time of reckoning. Katerina spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened anxiety, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She tried to focus on the small things, on the familiar routines, on the comfort of the house, of the garden, of Enzo's presence. But the impending arrival of Alessandro cast a dark shadow over everything, threatening to destroy the fragile peace she had found. Enzo was distant, preoccupied, his mind clearly focused on the upcoming confrontation. He spent hours on the phone, making calls, giving orders, preparing for whatever might come. She saw the ruthlessness in him, the cold, calculating strategist, the man who was ready to do whatever it took to protect what was his. As sunset approached, Katerina found herself in her room, changing into a simple but elegant dress, a deep burgundy color that mirrored the strength and defiance she felt within. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, seeing a woman who was different from the reluctant bride she had been just weeks before. She was stronger, more resilient, more determined. She heard the sound of a car approaching, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was time. She walked down the stairs, her head held high, her steps measured. She found Enzo in the entrance hall, waiting for her. He was dressed in a dark suit, looking every bit the powerful, imposing figure he was. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes searching hers. She nodded, her gaze meeting his, a silent understanding passing between them. "I am," she said, her voice firm. They walked together towards the front door, a united front against the threat that awaited them. As Enzo opened the door, Katerina saw Alessandro standing there, his expression smug, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating light. He was flanked by two men, their faces hard, their hands resting on the weapons they carried. "Katerina," Alessandro said, his voice smooth, but with an underlying edge of steel. "It's time to come home." Katerina stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "I am home," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This is where I choose to be." Alessandro's smile vanished, replaced by a look of anger, of betrayal. "You've been brainwashed," he said, his voice rising. "He's poisoned your mind." "No," Katerina said, her voice firm. "He's opened my eyes. He's shown me the truth." "The truth," Alessandro scoffed, turning to face Enzo. "You used her. You took advantage of a circumstance to make you look noble. You think this charade will save you?" Enzo stepped forward, his body tense, his eyes locked with Alessandro's. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice cold. "It's about Katerina. It's about her choice." Alessandro laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "Her choice? She doesn't have a choice. She's an Esposito. She belongs with her family. I belong where I choose to belong," Katerina said, her voice rising above the tension. "And I choose to stay here. With Enzo." Alessandro's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking between Katerina and Enzo. He took a step closer, his hand reaching inside his jacket, a subtle movement that did not go unnoticed by Enzo. "Don't be a fool, Katerina," Alessandro said, his voice low and menacing. "This infatuation will end. And when it does, you'll regret this decision." Before Katerina could respond, Enzo moved, his movements swift and decisive. He grabbed Alessandro's wrist, twisting it sharply, forcing him to drop the gun he had been reaching for. The two men with Alessandro moved to intervene, but Enzo's own men, who had been hidden in the shadows, appeared, their weapons drawn, effectively neutralizing the threat. The confrontation ended as quickly as it had begun. Alessandro, disarmed and defeated, stood there, his face contorted in rage, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over, Costa," Alessandro hissed, his voice filled with venom. "You've made a powerful enemy, and you will pay for this." Enzo didn't flinch. "Get out," he said, his voice cold and commanding. "And don't come back." Alessandro, with a final, venomous glare at Katerina, turned and left, his men following close behind. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Katerina's ragged breathing. She looked at Enzo, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something else. Something deeper, stronger. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his thumb wiping away a stray tear that had escaped her eye. "It's over," he said, his voice soft.
For now.
The serpent's kiss, the threat from her brother, had been deflected, but the venom lingered, a potent reminder of the dangers that still lurked. She knew this was only a temporary reprieve, a moment of calm before the inevitable storm. But for now, she was safe. For now, she was with him. And that was all that mattered. Chapter 8. Between Duty and Desire. The aftermath of Alessandro's visit left a palpable tension in the air, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. While the immediate threat had been neutralized, the underlying conflict remained, simmering beneath the surface, ready to erupt at any moment. Enzo became more vigilant, more protective, his movements shadowed by a constant awareness of danger. He increased security around the house, his men patrolling the grounds, their presence a visible deterrent. He rarely left Katerina's side, his gaze constantly scanning their surroundings, his hand always within reach. Katerina understood his concern, his need to protect her, but she also felt a growing sense of confinement, a stifling of the freedom she had begun to taste. She missed her solitary walks in the garden, her quiet moments of reflection, the sense of independence she had started to cultivate. She also sensed a shift in Enzo, a growing distance, a subtle withdrawal. He was still attentive, still caring, but there was a new wall between them, a barrier erected by the weight of responsibility, by the realization of the consequences of their actions. The passionate kiss they had shared, the confession of their feelings, seemed like a distant memory, a fragile dream overshadowed by the harsh reality of their world. They had not spoken of it since, the unspoken words hanging between them, a constant reminder of the forbidden nature of their love. One evening, Katerina found Enzo in the study, staring out the window at the darkening sky, his expression troubled. She approached him cautiously, her heart aching for the connection they had shared, the connection that seemed to be slipping away. "Enzo?" she said softly, her voice hesitant. He turned, his gray eyes meeting hers, a flicker of sadness in their depths. "Katerina," he said, his voice neutral, devoid of any emotion. She stood beside him, looking out at the same view, her silence inviting him to share his thoughts, his burdens. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and measured. "About us. About what we're doing." Katerina felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She knew what was coming, the inevitable conversation, the one she had been dreading.
"And?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, his expression weary. "This is complicated, Katerina," he said. "Dangerous. We're playing with fire." She nodded, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She knew he was right. Their love was a dangerous flame, one that could consume them both. "I know," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I can't help how I feel." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of desire and regret. "Neither can I," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "But I have a responsibility. To my family. To my people.
To you."
His words were a reminder of the obligations that bound him, the chains that held him captive to his duty, to his legacy. "And what about your own happiness?" she asked, her voice challenging. "What about what you want?" He didn't answer, his silence a painful confirmation of the conflict that raged within him. I can't risk your life, Katerina," he said, his voice strained. "Alessandro, he won't give up. He'll come after you. He'll use you to get to me." She understood his fear, his protectiveness. But she also refused to be a victim, a pawn in their game. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice firm. "I'm not a child, Enzo. I can handle myself." He looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes.
"I know you're not," he said.
"But I can't let anything happen to you." The conversation ended there, unresolved, the tension between them thicker than ever. They were caught between duty and desire, between the obligations of their world and the pull of their hearts. Katerina went to bed that night, her mind filled with turmoil, her heart aching with a longing she could not ignore. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night, feeling the emptiness beside her, the absence of Enzo's warmth, his touch. She knew that he was right. Their situation was dangerous, impossible. But she also knew that she could not deny her feelings, could not turn away from the love that had blossomed between them. She thought of his words, his confession, his vulnerability. She thought of the kiss they had shared, the passion, the connection, the unspoken promise. She made a decision. She would not give up. She would not let fear dictate her life. She would fight for what she wanted, for the love she had found, for the freedom she craved. She got out of bed, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She walked down the hallway, her steps silent, her destination clear. She found Enzo in the study, still awake, sitting in the same chair, staring out the window, his profile silhouetted against the faint moonlight. "Enzo," she said, her voice soft but firm. He turned, his gray eyes meeting hers, a question in their depths. She walked towards him, her gaze unwavering, her heart filled with a love that defied all logic, all reason. "I know the risks," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I know the dangers. But I don't care. I want to be with you, Enzo. I choose you." He stood up, his body tense, his eyes searching hers. He didn't say anything, but his gaze spoke volumes. He was torn, conflicted, but the desire in his eyes was undeniable. She reached out, her hand gently touching his cheek, her fingers tracing the contours of his face. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch, a sigh escaping his lips. "Katerina," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. She silenced him with a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a kiss that spoke of a love that was forbidden but inevitable. A kiss between two souls, not a mafia don and his captive. It was a kiss of equals. A kiss of hope. Chapter 9. The Price of Loyalty. The kiss marked a turning point, a silent agreement to defy the odds, to embrace the forbidden love that had blossomed between them. But the reality of their world, with its intricate web of loyalties and betrayals, soon intruded, casting a long shadow over their fragile happiness. Enzo, while undeniably drawn to Katerina, remained torn between his desire for her and his duty to his family, his legacy. He knew that their relationship was a vulnerability, a weapon that could be used against him, a threat to everything he had sworn to protect. He tried to maintain a distance, to keep his emotions in check, but it was a losing battle. Katerina had awakened something within him, a longing for a life beyond the darkness, a yearning for a love that was not tainted by the violence and the obligations of his world. Katerina, in turn, refused to be treated as a pawn, a prize to be protected or traded. She demanded to be included, to be informed, to be a part of his life, not just a hidden secret. She challenged him, pushed him, forced him to confront his own desires, his own fears. One day, Enzo received a message, a coded communication from one of his informants. It was news about the Bellinis, about their plans, their movements. It was also news about Alessandro, about his growing obsession with Katerina, his determination to get her back. Enzo shared the information with Katerina, his expression grim, his voice tight. "They're planning something," he said. "Alessandro is escalating things. He's becoming more reckless." Katerina felt a chill run down her spine, but she refused to show fear. "What are they planning?" she asked, her voice calm, steady. "They're trying to forge an alliance with another family," Enzo said. "The Russo family. A powerful, ruthless clan from the south. They're offering them a deal." "What kind of deal?" Katerina asked, her heart pounding. Enzo hesitated, his gaze meeting hers, a flicker of pain in their depths. "They're offering them you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "As a bride. To solidify the alliance." Katerina felt a surge of anger, of betrayal, of disgust. She was not a commodity, a piece of property to be traded. She was a woman, with her own will, her own desires. They can't do that, she said, her voice firm, defiant. I won't let them. Enzo looked at her, his admiration mixed with a growing sense of dread. It's not that simple, Katerina, he said. This is a declaration of war. If they succeed, it will upset the balance. It will give them too much power. Katerina understood the implications, the danger. It was not just about her, it was about the entire structure of their world, about the delicate equilibrium that kept the families from tearing each other apart. What can we do? She asked, her voice filled with a growing sense of urgency. Enzo thought for a moment, his mind racing, calculating the risks, the options. We need to stop them, he said. We need to disrupt their plans. We need to show them that you're not theirs to offer.
How?
Katerina asked. We need information, Enzo said. We need to know their movements, their strategies, their weaknesses. We need to find a way to turn the tables. Katerina nodded, her mind already working, piecing together the puzzle, searching for a solution. She knew people. She understood the dynamics of the families, the hidden rivalries, the secret alliances. I might be able to help, she said, her voice hesitant but determined. I have contacts. People who owe me favors. Enzo looked at her, surprised by her offer, by her willingness to get involved. Who? He asked. Katerina hesitated, her loyalty to her family warring with her desire to protect her newfound freedom, her love for Enzo. My cousin Isabella, she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. She's married to a man in the Russo family. She doesn't agree with Alessandro's methods. She might be willing to help. Enzo understood the risk, the potential betrayal. But he also saw the opportunity, the chance to gain an advantage, to outmaneuver his enemies. Can you trust her? I don't know, Katerina admitted. But I have to try. It is my only way to help without bloodshed. Enzo nodded, his gaze meeting hers, a silent understanding passing between them. They were in this together, partners in a dangerous game, bound by a love that defied all odds. That night, Katerina sent a message to Isabella, a carefully worded communication, using a code they had developed as children, a secret language that only they understood. It was a risk, a gamble, but she had no other choice. The wait for a response was agonizing, each hour stretching into an eternity. Katerina paced restlessly, her mind filled with anxiety, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. Finally, a message arrived, a cryptic response that confirmed Isabella's willingness to help, to provide information, to betray her own husband, her own family, for the sake of Katerina, for the sake of a different kind of loyalty. The price of loyalty was high, a constant balancing act between duty and desire, between family and freedom, between love and betrayal. Katerina had made her choice, and she was ready to face the consequences, whatever they might be. She had chosen Enzo, and she would stand by him, fight with him, until the very end. The game had begun, and she was no longer a pawn. She was a player, a force to be reckoned with. Chapter 10. Shattered Reflections. Isabella's information proved invaluable. It gave Enzo a crucial insight into the Bellini-Russo alliance, their plans, their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. It confirmed Alessandro's ruthless ambition, his willingness to sacrifice anything, even his own sister, to achieve his goals. Armed with this knowledge, Enzo began to formulate a plan, a counter-strategy to disrupt the alliance, to protect Katerina, to secure his own position. He worked tirelessly, meticulously planning every detail, anticipating every move, preparing for every contingency. He included Katerina in the process, valuing her insights, her knowledge of the families, her understanding of the intricate web of relationships that define their world. He treated her as an equal, a partner, a confidant, recognizing her strength, her intelligence, her courage. Their collaboration deepened their bond, strengthening the connection between them, solidifying their love. They worked side by side, sharing ideas, debating strategies, supporting each other through the fear, the uncertainty, the constant pressure. But the weight of their situation, the constant threat of danger, began to take its toll. Enzo became more withdrawn, more guarded, his sleep plagued by nightmares, his days consumed by anxiety. He saw the toll it was taking on Katerina as well she became thinner, and there were dark circles underneath her eyes. One night, Katerina found him in the study, staring at a map of the city, his face etched with worry, his eyes filled with a haunted look. She approached him cautiously, her heart aching for the burden he carried, the weight of responsibility he bore. "Enzo?" she said softly, her voice hesitant. He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the map, his mind lost in a labyrinth of calculations, of strategies, of potential outcomes. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle, reassuring. He flinched, startled by her presence, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of pain in their depths. I can't do this anymore, Katerina," he said, his voice raw, almost a whisper. "I can't risk your life. It's too much." Katerina felt a pang of fear, a sharp ache in her chest. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the despair, the doubt. She saw the man she loved, crumbling under the pressure, the weight of his world. "Don't say that," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "We're in this together. We'll get through this." He shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. "I should have never taken you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I should have left you alone. You would have been safe." "Safe?" she said, her voice rising in anger, in disbelief. "Safe with Marco? Safe in a loveless marriage? Safe as a pawn in their game?" He didn't answer, his silence a painful confirmation of his guilt, his regret. "I made my choice, Enzo," she said, her voice softer now but still firm. "I chose you, and I don't regret it. Not for a moment." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers, questioning her sincerity, her resolve. "But the danger," he said, his voice hesitant. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice strong, determined. "I'm not the same woman you took from that wedding, Enzo. I've changed. I've found my strength, and I'll use it to protect you, to protect us." Her words, her unwavering belief in him, in their love, seemed to reach him, to penetrate the darkness that had enveloped him. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb wiping away a stray tear that had escaped her eye. "You are incredible, Katerina," he said, his voice filled with admiration, with love. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the warmth of his hand against her skin, the closeness of his presence. "We'll face this together," she said, her voice a whisper. "We always will." The moment was broken by a sudden, sharp sound, the shattering of glass. They both jumped, startled, their bodies tensing, their senses on high alert. Enzo grabbed his gun, his movements swift and decisive. He pushed Katerina behind him, shielding her with his body. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. He moved towards the sound, his step silent, his body poised for action. Katerina followed him, her heart pounding in her chest, her fear battling with a fierce determination to protect him, to protect their love. They found the source of the sound in the drawing room. A large window had been broken, a brick lying on the floor amidst the shattered glass. Attached to the brick was a note. Enzo picked up the note, his expression grim, his eyes scanning the words. He crumpled the paper in his hand, his knuckles white, his body trembling with rage. "What is it?" Katerina asked, her voice filled with apprehension. He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own, a pain that cut deeper than any physical wound. "It's from Alessandro," he said, his voice raw, almost a whisper. He says he has Isabella. He says he'll kill her if I don't give you back." Katerina felt a wave of horror wash over her. Isabella. Her cousin. The woman who had risked everything to help her. Now, she was a pawn, a victim, caught in the crossfire of their war. The reflection of her life, of her choices, of her love, seemed to shatter around her, like the broken window, leaving her with a gaping hole of fear, of guilt, of despair. The price of loyalty had become too high, the cost of love too steep. She had brought this upon them, upon Isabella, upon Enzo. And she didn't know how to fix it. The carefully constructed world they built together lay in ruins, seemingly irreparable, and she was the cause. Chapter 11. Under a Veil of Secrets. The news of Isabella's captivity struck Katerina like a physical blow. Guilt, fear, and a desperate sense of responsibility washed over her, threatening to drown her in a sea of despair. She had brought this upon them, upon Isabella, upon Enzo. Her choices, her defiance, her love, had led to this. Enzo, despite his own shock and anger, remained outwardly calm, his focus shifting to damage control, to finding a solution, to saving Isabella. He knew that Alessandro was ruthless, that he would not hesitate to carry out his threat. "We need to verify it," he said, his voice tight, controlled. "We need to make sure it's not a trick, a bluff." He immediately contacted his network of informants, ordering them to gather information, to confirm Isabella's whereabouts, to assess the situation. The waiting was agonizing, each minute stretching into an eternity, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of the clock, a constant reminder of the time running out. Katerina paced restlessly, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She blamed herself, her conscience a relentless tormentor. She should have gone back. She should have sacrificed herself. She should have never allowed Enzo to get involved. "It's my fault," she said, her voice choked with emotion. I should have never." Enzo stopped her, his hands gently gripping her shoulders, his gray eyes meeting hers, filled with a fierce determination. "Don't," he said, his voice firm. "Don't blame yourself, Katerina. This is not your fault. It's Alessandro's. He's the one who's doing this. He's the one who's responsible." His words were meant to be reassuring, but she couldn't shake the feeling of guilt, the crushing weight of responsibility. "But if I had just," she began, her voice trembling. "No," he interrupted, his voice sharper this time. "There are no ifs. We can't change the past. We can only deal with the present.
And we will deal with it.
Together." His unwavering support, his refusal to let her succumb to despair, gave her a flicker of strength, a spark of hope. She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude, with love, with a renewed determination. "What can we do?" she asked, her voice calmer now, more focused.
"We need a plan," he said.
"We need to find her. We need to rescue her. But we need to be careful. Alessandro is expecting us. He's set a trap." They spent the next few hours huddled together, analyzing the situation, weighing their options, formulating a strategy. Enzo's informants confirmed Isabella's captivity, providing details about her location, a heavily guarded warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a known Bellini stronghold. The task was daunting, dangerous, almost impossible. But they had no choice. They had to save Isabella. They had to fight back. Enzo decided to use a combination of stealth and deception. He would not confront Alessandro directly, not yet. He would use his network of contacts, his knowledge of the underworld, to infiltrate the warehouse, to get to Isabella without alerting Alessandro, without triggering a bloodbath. He turned to the one person who knew the layout. "This warehouse," Enzo began, looking to Katerina. "Do you know it?" "I've been there," Katerina answered. "Years ago. My father used to take Alessandro and I to various locations to show us the family business. Do you remember the layout?" Katerina closed her eyes and pictured it. The loading docks, the offices, and the secret passages her father had shown her. "Yes," Katerina said. "There are hidden entrances, ways to get in and out undetected. If they haven't changed anything." As they finalized their plan, Enzo turned to Katerina, his expression serious, his eyes filled with concern. "You'll stay here," he said, his voice firm. "It's too dangerous." Katerina shook her head, her gaze unwavering.
"No," she said.
"I'm going with you. Isabella is my family. I'm responsible for her. And I'm not afraid." Enzo hesitated, his desire to protect her warring with his respect for her strength, her determination. He knew that she would not be deterred, that she would not be left behind. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "But you'll follow my lead. You'll do exactly what I say. No arguments." She nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. They were a team, partners, bound by a love that defied all odds, united against a common enemy. Under a veil of secrets, under the cover of darkness, they prepared to embark on a dangerous mission, a rescue operation that could cost them everything. They were risking their lives, their freedom, their love for the sake of loyalty, for the sake of family, for the sake of what was right. The stakes were high, the danger real, but they were ready. They would face the darkness together, and they would emerge, victorious or not, as one. She would not cower, and she knew, looking into his steel-gray eyes, neither would he. Chapter 12. The Lion's Denver. The journey to the warehouse was tense, silent, the air thick with anticipation and dread. Enzo drove with a focused intensity, his hands tight on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly scanning the road ahead, the surrounding darkness. Katerina sat beside him, her body taut, her senses on high alert, her mind replaying the layout of the warehouse, the hidden passages, the potential dangers. They arrived at the outskirts of the city, the industrial landscape a desolate expanse of factories, warehouses, and abandoned buildings. The air was heavy with the smell of chemicals and decay, a stark contrast to the quiet elegance of the Costo estate. Enzo parked the car in a secluded alleyway, several blocks from the warehouse, hidden from view. He turned to Katerina, his gray eyes serious, his voice low and urgent. "Remember the plan," he said.
Stick close to me.
"Don't speak unless spoken to. And trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, tell me immediately." Katerina nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She had rehearsed the plan countless times, memorized every detail, every contingency. But the reality of the situation, the imminent danger, was far more terrifying than any imagined scenario. They left the car, moving silently through the shadows, blending into the darkness, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The warehouse loomed ahead, a large, imposing structure, its windows dark and menacing, its walls scarred with graffiti and age. Enzo led the way, his movements fluid and graceful, his body poised for action. He was a predator in his element, comfortable in the darkness, familiar with the language of violence and deception. They reached the perimeter of the warehouse, skirting the main entrance, avoiding the heavily guarded loading docks. Enzo located the hidden entrance Katerina had described, a small, inconspicuous door concealed behind a stack of discarded pallets. He produced a set of lock picks, his fingers working deftly, expertly, the tumblers clicking softly in the silence. The door opened with a faint creak, revealing a narrow, dark passageway, the air musty and stale. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them, plunging themselves into the belly of the beast, into the heart of the enemy's territory. The passageway was narrow, claustrophobic, the walls lined with pipes and wires, the floor covered in dust and debris. Enzo moved ahead, his hand resting on the gun tucked into his waistband, his senses scanning the darkness, listening for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. Katerina followed close behind, her hand brushing against his back, a silent reassurance, a source of strength and comfort. They navigated the labyrinthine corridors, following Katerina's memory of the layout, the hidden passages, the secret rooms. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water, the distant hum of machinery, the faint echo of voices. They reached a junction, a point where the passageway split into two directions. Katerina hesitated, her mind struggling to recall the correct path. "Left," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I think it's left." Enzo nodded, his gaze meeting hers, a silent understanding passing between them. He trusted her instincts, her knowledge, her memory. They continued down the left passageway, the darkness deepening, the air growing colder. They reached a dead end, a solid wall of brick. Katerina felt a surge of panic, a wave of doubt. Had she remembered correctly? Had she led them into a trap? "Wait," she whispered, her hand reaching out, touching the wall. There's a hidden panel. Somewhere here." Her fingers searched the brick, feeling for any irregularity, any sign of a seam, a crack, a hidden mechanism. She found it a small, almost imperceptible indentation, a pressure point that released the panel, revealing a narrow opening, another secret passage. They squeezed through the opening, entering a larger room, dimly lit by a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room was filled with crates, boxes, and various pieces of equipment, a storage area for the warehouse's illicit activities. They heard voices, coming from the other side of the room, from behind a closed door. Enzo motioned for Katerina to stay back, his hand moving to his gun, his body tensing, preparing for a confrontation. He approached the door cautiously, his ear pressed against the wood, listening to the conversation, trying to identify the speakers, to assess the situation. Katerina recognized Alessandro's voice, his tone arrogant, demanding, his words laced with cruelty. She also heard another voice, a woman's voice, weak, trembling, filled with pain. Isabella. Enzo turned to Katerina, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and determination. He nodded, a silent signal. It was time. He kicked the door open, bursting into the room, his gun drawn, his body poised for action. Katerina followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest, her fear battling with a fierce determination to save her cousin, to confront her brother, to end this nightmare. They had entered the lion's den, and the roar of the confrontation was about to begin. This was it. There was no turning back. Chapter 13. A Dance with Deception. The room was small, sparsely furnished, with a single table and a few chairs. Alessandro stood at the far end of the room, his back to the door, his attention focused on Isabella, who was tied to a chair, her face bruised and swollen, her eyes filled with terror. Two armed guards stood beside Alessandro, their weapons trained on Isabella. Alessandro whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in anger as he saw Enzo and Katerina. Well, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look who finally decided to show up. I was beginning to think you'd abandoned your little pet, Costa. Enzo ignored the taunt, his gaze fixed on Isabella, assessing her condition, calculating the best way to get her out of there alive. Let her go, Alessandro, Enzo said, his voice cold, commanding. This is between you and me. Alessandro laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the room. Oh, I don't think so, Costa, he said. She's my leverage. My insurance policy. You give me Katerina, and I'll let her live. Simple as that. Katerina stepped forward, her gaze unwavering, her voice filled with defiance. I'm not going anywhere with you, Alessandro, she said. I made my choice. And I'm staying with Enzo. Alessandro's expression darkened, his eyes burning with hatred. You ungrateful bitch, he snarled. You've betrayed your family. You've chosen this scum over your own blood. He's a better man than you'll ever be, Katerina retorted, her voice trembling with anger. He treats me with respect, with kindness, with love. Something you know nothing about. Alessandro's hand moved to his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. You'll regret those words, Katerina, he said, his voice low and menacing. Before Alessandro could react, Enzo moved, his movements swift and decisive. He fired his gun, the bullet hitting one of the guards in the shoulder, sending him sprawling to the floor. The other guard turned, raising his weapon, but Enzo was faster. He fired again, this time hitting the guard in the chest, killing him instantly. The room erupted in chaos. Alessandro, enraged and disoriented, lunged at Enzo, tackling him to the ground. They wrestled, grappling for control of the gun, their bodies locked in a desperate struggle. Katerina, seeing Enzo in danger, reacted instinctively. She grabbed a heavy metal pipe that was leaning against the wall and swung it with all her might, hitting Alessandro on the head. He slumped to the floor, unconscious, his body limp. Enzo quickly got to his feet, his breath ragged, his clothes disheveled. He looked at Katerina, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Are you all right? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Katerina nodded, her hands trembling, her body shaking from the adrenaline rush. Yes, she said. Are you? I'm fine, he said. He turned his attention to Isabella, who was still tied to the chair, her eyes wide with fear and relief. Enzo quickly untied her, helping her to her feet. She was weak, bruised, and shaken, but she was alive. "Katerina," Isabella whispered, her voice hoarse, her eyes filled with tears. Thank you both." Katerina embraced her cousin, holding her tightly, her own tears flowing freely.
"It's all right," she said.
"You're safe now." Enzo surveyed the room, his mind already working, planning their escape. Alessandro was unconscious, but he would not remain that way for long. They needed to get out of there quickly. "We need to go," he said, his voice urgent.
"Now."
He led the way, guiding Katerina and Isabella out of the room, back through the hidden passageways towards the secret exit. They moved swiftly, silently, their senses on high alert, listening for any sign of pursuit. They reached the outside, the cool night air a welcome relief after the stifling atmosphere of the warehouse. They ran towards the car, their footsteps echoing in the silence, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. They piled into the car, Enzo starting the engine, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. He sped away, leaving the warehouse, the chaos, the violence behind them. They had succeeded. They had rescued Isabella. They had defeated Alessandro, for now. But the dance with deception was far from over. The battle had been won, but the war was still raging. And they knew that Alessandro would be back, seeking revenge, more determined than ever to destroy them. But for now, they were together, they were safe, and they had each other. And that was all that mattered. They had stared into the lion's den and emerged, battered but not broken. Chapter 14. The Heart's Reckoning. The escape from the warehouse marked a turning point, a shift in the balance of power, a moment of triumph amidst the ongoing conflict. They had rescued Isabella, defied Alessandro, and proven their strength, their resilience, their unity. But the victory was bittersweet, tainted by the knowledge that the war was far from over, that Alessandro would not rest until he had his revenge. They took Isabella to a safe house, a secluded location known only to Enzo and a few trusted members of his inner circle. She was treated by a doctor, her injuries tended to, her emotional wounds soothed by Katerina's presence, by the reassurance that she was safe, that she was no longer in Alessandro's clutches. Katerina stayed by Isabella's side, nursing her back to health, providing comfort and support, rebuilding the bond that had been strained by family loyalty and betrayal. Isabella, in turn, shared her story, the details of her captivity, the cruelty of Alessandro, the desperation she had felt. I thought he would kill me," Isabella whispered, her voice weak, her eyes filled with tears. "He enjoyed it. The power, the control. He's not the brother you once knew, Katerina." Katerina knew that. She had seen it in his eyes, in his actions, in the cold, ruthless way he had treated her, Isabella, Enzo. Alessandro had become a monster, consumed by ambition, by a thirst for power that had twisted his soul, corrupted his heart. "He's not my brother anymore," Katerina said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "He's my enemy, and I won't let him hurt anyone else." Enzo, meanwhile, focused on the larger picture, on the ongoing war with the Bellinis, on the threat that Alessandro still posed. He knew that he had to act, to strike back, to end this conflict once and for all. He gathered his men, his loyal soldiers, his trusted advisors. He laid out his plan, a bold, daring strategy to dismantle the Bellini Empire, to expose their crimes, to bring them down. It was a risky plan, a dangerous gamble, but he had no other choice. He had to protect Katerina, he had to protect his family, he had to protect his legacy. He also knew that he needed to confront his own feelings, his own desires, his own fears. He had fallen in love with Katerina, deeply, irrevocably, but he had also put her in danger, made her a target, exposed her to a world of violence and betrayal. One evening, he found her in the garden of the safe house, sitting on a bench, staring at the sunset, her expression thoughtful, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. He approached her cautiously, his heart aching for the burden she carried, the weight of the choices she had made. "Katerina," he said softly, his voice hesitant. She turned, her gaze meeting his, a flicker of warmth in their depths. "Enzo," she said, her voice equally soft. He sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her body, but not touching. The silence stretched between them, comfortable, familiar, a silent understanding that transcended words. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low and measured, "about everything. About us. About what we've been through." Katerina nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon, the colors of the sunset painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. "Me too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I never intended for any of this to happen," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I never wanted to put you in danger, to make you a part of this mess." She turned to him, her eyes meeting his, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "It's not your fault, Enzo," she said. "I made my own choices. I chose to stay with you. I chose to fight. I chose to love you." Her words, her unwavering belief in him, in their love, touched him deeply. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the contours of her face. "And I love you, Katerina," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "More than anything. More than my family, more than my legacy, more than my own life." It was the first time he had said those words, the first time he had openly confessed his love, his vulnerability. It was a moment of truth, a moment of reckoning, a moment of surrender. Katerina's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, of relief, of a love that had endured the trials, the dangers, the uncertainties. "I love you too, Enzo," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. He leaned in, his lips meeting hers, a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their destiny. It was a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of understanding, of a future they would build together, a future free from the shadows, from the violence, from the betrayals. The heart's reckoning had been made. They had faced their fears, their doubts, their regrets. They had chosen love, they had chosen each other, and they were ready to face whatever the future held, together, united, unbreakable. The storm still raged around them, but in the center, in their hearts, there was peace, there was love, there was hope. Chapter 15. Beyond the point of no return. With their love confessed and their commitment solidified, Katerina and Enzo faced the daunting task of dismantling the Bellini Empire. The stakes were higher than ever, the danger more palpable, but their resolve was unwavering. They were fighting not just for survival, but for a future together, a future free from the shadows of their past. Enzo's plan was intricate and audacious, a multi-pronged attack designed to expose the Bellini's criminal activities, disrupt their alliances, and ultimately bring them down. He utilized his network of informants, his connections within the underworld, and even leveraged his uneasy truce with other families, convincing them that the Bellini's growing power threatened them all. Katerina played a crucial role, using her knowledge of the families, her contacts, and her own sharp intellect to provide valuable insights, identify weaknesses, and even facilitate communication with potential allies. She was no longer a passive observer, but an active participant, a force to be reckoned with. One crucial element of their plan involved exposing Alessandro's dealings to the authorities. It was a risky move, a violation of the unspoken code of silence that governed their world, but it was necessary. They needed to cripple the Bellinis, to strip them of their power, to ensure they could never hurt anyone again. Enzo had a contact within the police force, a detective who had been investigating the Bellinis for years, but had been hampered by corruption and lack of evidence. This detective, a man named Rossi, was weary of the endless cycle of violence and impunity and was willing to take a risk, to bend the rules, to bring the Bellinis to justice. Katerina and Enzo met with Rossi secretly, providing him with the evidence they had gathered, the information Isabella had provided, and the details of Alessandro's operations. Rossi was initially skeptical, wary of trusting Acosta, But Katerina's sincerity and Enzo's unwavering determination convinced him. "This is dangerous," Rossi said, his voice low, his eyes scanning their faces. "If this gets out, it could cost me my career, my life." "We understand the risk," Enzo said, his voice firm. "But we're willing to take it. We need your help to stop them. To end this." Rossi nodded, his expression grim, his resolve hardening. "All right," he said. "I'm in. But we need to be careful. We need to be smart. One wrong move, and we're all dead." With Rossi's cooperation, they set their plan in motion. They leaked information to the press, exposing the Bellinis' involvement in drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and human trafficking. They provided Rossi with evidence, documents, recordings, and witness testimonies, building a case that was irrefutable. The public outcry was immediate and intense. The press, fueled by the leaks and the growing evidence, launched a full-scale investigation, exposing the Bellinis' crimes to the world, shattering their carefully constructed facade of legitimacy. The authorities, under pressure from the public and armed with Rossi's evidence, launched a series of raids, targeting the Bellinis' businesses, their properties, their warehouses. Alessandro and his associates were arrested, their assets seized, their empire crumbling around them. Alessandro, cornered and desperate, tried to retaliate, to strike back at Enzo and Caterina, but his efforts were futile. His network had been dismantled, his allies had abandoned him, his power had evaporated. He sent threats, messages filled with venom and hatred, vowing to make them pay, to destroy them, but they were empty threats, the desperate ramblings of a broken man. Caterina and Enzo, despite the constant danger, the constant threat of retaliation, remained steadfast, their love a shield against the darkness, their commitment to each other unwavering. They had reached a point of no return, a point where there was no going back, no turning back. They had crossed the line, violated the code, defied the traditions of their world. They had chosen love over loyalty, justice over family, freedom over obligation. And they were ready to face the consequences, whatever they might be. They had burned their bridges, destroyed their past, and were now forging a new future, a future built on trust, on love, on a shared vision of a world free from the shadows, from the violence, from the betrayals. The victory was near, but the final battle was yet to come. They had dealt a significant blow, but Alessandro was still out there, wounded, cornered, and desperate. And they knew he would not go down without a fight. Chapter 16. Flames of Rebellion. Despite the significant blow dealt to the Bellini Empire, Alessandro remained a threat, a wounded animal cornered and desperate. He had lost his power, his influence, his network, but he still possessed a burning desire for revenge, relentless determination to make Enzo and Caterina pay for his downfall. He went into hiding, evading the authorities, disappearing into the shadows, plotting his next move. He had few allies left, only a handful of loyal followers who were willing to risk everything for him, driven by a mixture of fear and misplaced loyalty. Enzo and Caterina knew that Alessandro would not give up, that he would strike back, but they didn't know when, where, or how. They remained vigilant, increasing security around the safe house, their movements restricted, their lives overshadowed by the constant threat of attack. They received reports from their informants, whispers of Alessandro's movements, his desperate attempts to regroup, to gather resources, to find a way to retaliate. He was like a ghost, a phantom, haunting their lives, a constant reminder of the danger that still lurked. One evening, Caterina and Enzo were in the study of the safe house, discussing their next steps, trying to anticipate Alessandro's next move. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation and dread. "He's becoming more reckless," Enzo said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the reports from his informants. "He's running out of options. He's desperate." Caterina nodded, her expression grim, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination.
"He'll try something soon," she said.
"He won't just disappear." As if on cue, the lights flickered, then went out, plunging the house into darkness. A moment of silence, followed by the sound of shattering glass, the shouts of men, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Enzo reacted instantly, grabbing his gun, pushing Katerina behind him, shielding her with his body. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Don't move." He moved towards the sound of the attack, his steps silent, his body poised for action. Katerina, despite her fear, disobeyed his order. She wouldn't stay put. She grabbed a small pistol Enzo had given her for protection, her hand trembling, her heart pounding. The safe house erupted in chaos. Gunfire echoed through the halls, bullets ricocheting off walls, shattering glass, tearing through furniture. Enzo's men engaged the attackers, a fierce firefight unfolding in the darkness. Katerina followed Enzo, staying close behind him, her senses on high alert, her finger on the trigger of her gun. She saw flashes of movement, shadows darting through the darkness, the muzzle flashes of guns illuminating the scene in brief, terrifying bursts. They reached the main hall, the epicenter of the attack. Several of Enzo's men lay dead or wounded, the floor covered in blood. Alessandro's men, a small but determined group, were advancing, their faces masked, their weapons blazing. Enzo engaged them, firing his gun with deadly accuracy, taking down several of the attackers. Katerina, her fear battling with a fierce determination to protect Enzo, to protect their love, raised her own gun and fired, hitting one of the attackers in the leg, sending him sprawling to the floor. The firefight was intense, brutal, a desperate struggle for survival. Katerina saw one of Alessandro's men approaching Enzo from behind, his gun raised, ready to fire. She screamed a warning, but it was too late. The man fired, the bullet hitting Enzo in the shoulder, spinning him around, sending him crashing to the floor. Katerina, her heart filled with terror, rushed to his side, firing her gun at the attacker, hitting him in the chest, killing him instantly. She knelt beside Enzo, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with tears. He was bleeding heavily, his face pale, his breathing ragged. "Enzo!" she cried, her voice choked with emotion. "Enzo, stay with me." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with pain, but also with love, with a fierce determination. "Katerina," he whispered, his voice weak. "Get out of here, save yourself now," she said, her voice firm, defiant. "I'm not leaving you. I'm not going anywhere." She ripped a piece of fabric from her dress, pressing it against his wound, trying to stem the bleeding. She looked around, desperately searching for help, for a way out. The remaining attackers were closing in, their numbers dwindling, but still a threat. Katerina raised her gun, her hand steady, her eyes filled with a cold, ruthless determination. She would protect Enzo, she would fight to the death, she would not let them take him from her. The flames of rebellion burned brightly within her, fueled by her love for Enzo, by her determination to survive, by her refusal to be a victim. She was no longer the reluctant bride, the pawn in a dangerous game. She was a warrior, a protector, a woman fighting for her love, for her freedom, for her future. The battle raged on, the outcome uncertain, but she would not yield, she would not surrender, she would fight until her last breath. Chapter 17. Scars of the Soul. The firefight raged on, a chaotic dance of death and survival. Katerina, fueled by adrenaline and a fierce determination to protect Enzo, fought with a ferocity she never knew she possessed. She fired her gun, taking down another attacker, her movements precise, her aim deadly. But the odds were stacked against them. Alessandro's men, though dwindling in number, were relentless, driven by a desperate loyalty and a burning desire for revenge. They were closing in, their weapons blazing, their intentions clear. Katerina knew that they couldn't stay there, that they had to escape, to find a way to get Enzo to safety, to get him medical attention. His wound was serious. He was losing blood rapidly, his life hanging in the balance. She looked around, desperately searching for an escape route, a way out of the chaos. She saw a door, slightly ajar, leading to a back exit, a possible path to freedom. "Enzo," she whispered, her voice urgent, her hand pressing against his wound, trying to stem the bleeding. "We need to go."
"Now."
He nodded weakly, his eyes filled with pain, his body trembling with the effort to stay conscious. Katerina helped him to his feet, supporting his weight, her arm around his waist, guiding him towards the door. They moved slowly, painfully, each step in agony, each breath a struggle. They reached the door, slipping through the opening, emerging into the cool night air. They were outside, but still in danger, still exposed, still within reach of Alessandro's men. Katerina saw a car, parked nearby, a possible escape vehicle. She led Enzo towards it, her body shielding his, her gun raised, ready to defend them both. They reached the car, Katerina fumbling with the lock, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. She managed to open the door, pushing Enzo inside, then climbing in herself, slamming the door shut. She started the engine, the roar of the motor a welcome sound, a signal of hope, of a possible escape. She put the car in gear, her foot pressing on the accelerator, speeding away from the safe house, from the chaos, from the violence. She drove recklessly, desperately, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of pursuit. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew that she had to get Enzo to safety, to get him medical attention, to save his life. She drove for miles, the city lights blurring into streaks of color, the darkness a comforting cloak, hiding them from their enemies. She finally found a small, secluded clinic, a place where she hoped they could find help, without attracting unwanted attention. She pulled up to the clinic, her hands trembling, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. She helped Enzo out of the car, supporting his weight, guiding him inside. The clinic was small, dimly lit, but clean and staffed. A doctor, alerted by their arrival, rushed to their aid, examining Enzo's wound, his expression grim. "He needs surgery," the doctor said, his voice urgent. "He's lost a lot of blood. We need to operate immediately." Katerina nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and relief. She had found help. She had gotten Enzo to safety, but his life still hung in the balance. She watched as they took Enzo away, his body limp, his face pale, his eyes closed. She felt helpless, desperate, her fate intertwined with his, her love a fragile thread connecting them. She waited, pacing restlessly, her mind racing, her heart pounding. The hours stretched into an eternity, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of the clock, a constant reminder of the time passing, of the life that hung in the balance. Finally, the doctor emerged, his expression tired but relieved.
"He's stable," he said.
"The surgery was successful. We've stopped the bleeding. But he's still weak.
He needs rest.
He needs time to recover." Katerina felt a wave of relief wash over her, a release of tension that left her weak and trembling. He was alive. He was going to be all right. She was allowed to see him, to sit by his side, to hold his hand, to whisper words of love and comfort. He was unconscious, his face pale, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. And that was all that mattered. The scars of the soul, the wounds inflicted by the violence, the betrayals, the constant threat of danger, ran deep. But their love, their resilience, their unwavering commitment to each other had proven stronger. They had survived, they had endured, and they would heal together. The battle had been brutal, the cost high, but they had emerged, scarred but not broken, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness. The road to recovery would be long, but she was ready. Chapter 18. The Unraveling Truth. Enzo's recovery was slow but steady. He remained in the clinic for several days, under the watchful eye of the doctor and the constant care of Katerina. She never left his side, sleeping in a chair beside his bed, holding his hand, whispering words of encouragement, her love a constant presence, a healing balm. As he regained strength, he began to talk, to share his thoughts, his fears, his regrets. He spoke of the attack, of the moment he was shot, of the fear he felt, not for himself, but for Katerina. I thought I had lost you," he whispered, his voice weak, his eyes filled with emotion. "I thought he had won." Katerina squeezed his hand, her own eyes filling with tears.
You didn't lose me, she said.
I'm here. I'm always here. He spoke of his past, of his father's death, of the burden of responsibility he had carried, of the darkness that had consumed him. He spoke of his desire for revenge, of his relentless pursuit of the Bellinis, of the choices he had made, the mistakes he had committed.
I was so focused on the past, he said.
On avenging my father. On protecting my family. I didn't see what was right in front of me.
You.
Katerina listened, her heart aching for the pain he had endured, for the sacrifices he had made, for the weight of the world he had carried on his shoulders. It's over now, Enzo, she said. You don't have to carry that burden anymore. We're free. We can start a new life. Together. He smiled weakly, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope, a glimmer of a future he had never dared to dream of. As Enzo recovered, the news of Alessandro's downfall spread. The authorities, armed with the evidence Rossi had provided, continued their investigation, uncovering a vast network of corruption, of criminal activities, of betrayal and deceit. Alessandro, still in hiding, was a fugitive, hunted by both the law and the remnants of his shattered empire. His allies had deserted him, his power had vanished, his reputation destroyed. He was a pariah, an outcast, a symbol of the darkness that had consumed him. One day, Katerina received a message, a cryptic communication from an unexpected source. It was from Isabella, who had recovered from her injuries and was now living in hiding, protected by Enzo's network. The message contained information, shocking information, about Alessandro, about his past, about the true circumstances of his father's death. It was information that would change everything, that would unravel the truth, that would expose the secrets that had been hidden for so long. Katerina shared the message with Enzo, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. He read the words, his eyes widening in disbelief, then narrowing in anger, his expression shifting from shock to a cold, hard determination. This changes everything, he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the message. This is not what I thought. Not what I believed. The message revealed that Alessandro's father, Marco Bellini Sr., had not been killed by a rival family, as Enzo had always believed. He had been killed by Alessandro himself. Alessandro, driven by a ruthless ambition, by a thirst for power that had consumed him even as a young man, had orchestrated his own father's death, framing a rival family to cover his tracks, to seize control of the Bellini Empire. It was a betrayal of unimaginable proportions, a violation of the most sacred bonds of family, a crime that had gone unpunished for years. Enzo had spent his life seeking revenge for a crime that had never happened, fighting a war that had been based on a lie. I don't understand, Katerina said, her voice filled with confusion, with disbelief.
Why?
Why would he do that? Enzo looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own, a pain that cut deeper than any physical wound. He was obsessed with power, Enzo said. He wanted it all. He wanted to be the most powerful man in the city. He saw his father as an obstacle, a weakness. The truth was a devastating blow, a shattering of everything Enzo had believed, everything he had fought for. It was a betrayal that reached beyond the grave, a wound that would never fully heal. But it was also a liberation. It freed him from the past, from the burden of revenge, from the darkness that had consumed him. It allowed him to see Alessandro for who he truly was, a monster, a traitor, a man who deserved no loyalty, no mercy. The unraveling truth had changed everything. It had shattered the foundations of their world, exposed the lies, the secrets, the betrayals. But it had also paved the way for a new beginning, a new future, a future built on truth, on justice, on love. The final confrontation was looming, but now it was not about revenge. It was about justice. And it was personal. Chapter 19. A Love Forged in Fire. The revelation of Alessandro's treachery changed the dynamics of the conflict, shifting the focus from revenge to justice, from a battle between families to a confrontation with a single, desperate enemy. Enzo, freed from the burden of a misguided vendetta, was now driven by a desire to bring Alessandro to justice, to expose his crimes, to end his reign of terror once and for all. He knew that Alessandro was still out there, hiding, plotting, desperate for a way to strike back. He was a wounded animal, cornered and dangerous, but he was also alone, his resources depleted, his allies gone. Enzo used his network of informants, his connections within the underworld, to track Alessandro's movements, to anticipate his next move, to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. He also worked closely with Detective Rossi, sharing information, coordinating their efforts, determined to bring Alessandro to justice through legal means, to expose his crimes to the world. Caterina, despite her fear, remained steadfastly by Enzo's side, her love a source of strength, her presence a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. She refused to be sidelined, to be treated as a victim, to be hidden away. She was a partner, an equal, a warrior in her own right. One day, they received a tip, a reliable source informing them of Alessandro's location, a secluded hideout on the outskirts of the city, a dilapidated warehouse, a forgotten relic of his shattered empire. Enzo knew that this was it, the final confrontation, the moment of truth. He prepared his men, a small, loyal group, armed and ready for battle. He also informed Rossi, coordinating their efforts, ensuring that Alessandro would be captured, that justice would be served. He turned to Caterina, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "You stay here," he said, his voice firm, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "This is too dangerous. I can't risk your life." Caterina shook her head, her gaze unwavering, her voice filled with determination.
"No," she said.
"I'm going with you. I won't be left behind. I need to see this through. With you." Enzo hesitated, his desire to protect her warring with his respect for her strength, her courage, her unwavering commitment. He knew that she would not be deterred, that she would not be denied. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "But you stay close to me. You follow my lead. And you do exactly what I say.
No arguments."
She nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. They were a team, partners, bound by a love that had been forged in fire, tested by adversity, strengthened by their shared experiences. They set off, a small convoy of cars, heading towards Alessandro's hideout, the darkness a cloak concealing their movements, the silence broken only by the hum of the engines, the anticipation of the confrontation to come. They arrived at the warehouse, a desolate, abandoned building, surrounded by overgrown weeds, a symbol of Alessandro's downfall, his shattered dreams. Enzo and his men approached cautiously, their weapons drawn, their senses on high alert. They surrounded the building, cutting off any escape routes, preparing to storm the hideout. Rossi and his team arrived shortly after, their presence a reassuring sign that justice would be served, that Alessandro would be held accountable for his crimes. Enzo gave the signal, and they moved in, bursting through the doors, their weapons blazing, their voices shouting commands. The warehouse was dark, empty, silent. Alessandro was gone. They searched the building, finding signs of recent occupation, evidence of Alessandro's desperate attempts to survive, to plot his revenge. But he was nowhere to be found. He had anticipated their arrival, evaded their trap, slipped through their fingers once again. Enzo felt a surge of frustration, of anger, of disappointment. He had come so close, he had almost had him, but Alessandro had escaped once again. But then he saw it. A small, almost imperceptible detail, a clue that Alessandro had overlooked. A footprint, fresh, leading away from the warehouse, towards a nearby wooded area. He pointed it out to Caterina, his eyes meeting hers, a silent understanding passing between them. Alessandro was still close, he was on foot, he was vulnerable. They followed the footprints, leaving the warehouse, entering the woods, the darkness deepening, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the sound of their own breathing. They tracked him, their senses on high alert, their bodies tense, their hearts pounding. They were hunters, pursuing their prey, their love a driving force, their determination unwavering. They found him, finally, standing on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the city, his back to them, his figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the dawn. Enzo and Katerina approached him slowly, silently, their weapons raised, their fingers on the triggers. They had him cornered, trapped, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Alessandro turned, his face a mask of hatred, of despair, of defeat. He looked at Enzo, his eyes burning with a venomous rage. "You," he snarled, his voice hoarse, his body trembling. "You took everything from me. My family, my empire, my life." Enzo met his gaze, his expression cold, his voice devoid of emotion. "You did that to yourself, Alessandro," he said. "You chose this path. You betrayed your family. You betrayed your father. You betrayed everyone." Enzo continued, his voice unwavering. "I came here for justice, Alessandro. For what you did to your father, and for what you tried to do to us." Alessandro laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Justice?" he scoffed. "There is no justice. Only power. And you. You will never have what I had. You will never be me." He raised his hand. He had a gun. He had the advantage. But before Alessandro could fire, a shot rang out. Not from Enzo's direction. From Katerina's. Alessandro, hit square between the eyes, fell backwards. Katerina, standing beside Enzo, her body shaking, the small pistol she had used dropping from her numb fingers. Enzo rushed to her, wrapping his arms around her. "It's over," Enzo told her. "It's finally over." Their love, forged in the crucible of violence and betrayal, had emerged stronger, purer, unbreakable. They had faced the darkness together, and they had won. The final battle had been fought, the enemy defeated, the future theirs to embrace. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The echoes of the gunshot faded into the stillness of the dawn, leaving behind a silence that was both profound and unsettling. Alessandro was gone, his reign of terror ended, his threat extinguished. But the cost had been high, the scars deep, the wounds lingering. Katerina stood there, trembling, her body numb, her mind reeling from the events that had just transpired. She had killed a man, her own brother, a man who had once been her protector, her confidant, her family. She had done what was necessary, what was unavoidable, but the act had left an indelible mark on her soul. Enzo held her close, his arms wrapped around her, his body a shield against the harsh reality of the world, his love a comforting presence in the aftermath of the violence. He understood the burden she carried, the weight of her actions, the conflict that raged within her. "It's all right, Katerina," he whispered, his voice gentle, his breath warm against her ear. "You did what you had to do. You saved my life. You saved us." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain, of relief, of a love that had endured the ultimate test. She saw the understanding in his gaze, the compassion, the unwavering support. He would have killed you," she said, her voice trembling, her throat constricted with emotion. "He would have destroyed everything." Enzo nodded, his hand gently stroking her hair, his touch soothing, reassuring. "I know," he said. "And you stopped him. You were incredible." They stood there for a long moment, clinging to each other, their bodies intertwined, their hearts beating as one. The dawn broke, casting a golden glow over the horizon, illuminating the scene with a soft, ethereal light. It was a new day, a new beginning, a future free from the shadows of the past. Detective Rossi and his team arrived, securing the scene, taking control of the situation. They confirmed Alessandro's death, their expressions grim, their voices somber. The reign of terror was over, but the aftermath would be long and complicated. Rossi approached Enzo and Katerina, his gaze filled with a mixture of respect and gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "You did what needed to be done. You brought him to justice. You ended this." Enzo nodded, his expression somber, his heart heavy with the weight of the events, the loss of life, the destruction that had been wrought. It wasn't about justice, Enzo said, his voice low. Not anymore. It was about protecting what mattered. Protecting each other. Rossi understood. He saw the love between them, the bond that had been forged in fire, the strength that had emerged from the darkness.
You have a future now, Rossi said.
A chance to start over. To build something new. Something better. Enzo and Caterina looked at each other, their eyes meeting, a silent understanding passing between them. They had a future, a chance, a love that had survived the ultimate test. They left the scene, leaving behind the darkness, the violence, the betrayals. They walked away, hand in hand, their bodies close, their hearts intertwined, their love a beacon of hope in a world that had been shattered by conflict. The final confrontation had been fought, not just between enemies, but within their own hearts, their own souls. They had confronted their past, their loyalties, their fears, their desires. They had made choices, difficult choices, choices that had cost them dearly, but choices that had ultimately led them to each other, to a love that was stronger, purer, more resilient than anything they had ever imagined. The scars remained, a reminder of the battles they had fought, the wounds they had endured, but they were also a symbol of their strength, their courage, their unwavering commitment to each other. They had emerged from the darkness, transformed, reborn, their love a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, the ability to find hope in the midst of despair, to find light in the midst of shadows, to find love in the midst of hate. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties had ended, and love had prevailed. Their future was now an open book, waiting to be written together. Epilogue. Years passed. The scars of the past, though still present, faded with time, becoming reminders of the battles fought, the love forged, the resilience discovered. Caterina and Enzo built a new life together, far from the shadows of the mafia world, far from the violence and betrayals that had once defined their existence. They left Italy, settling in a quiet coastal town in a remote corner of the world, a place where they could be anonymous, where they could live in peace, where they could raise their children without the fear of reprisal, without the weight of their family legacies. They built a home, a sanctuary, a haven filled with love, with laughter, with the warmth of family. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, whom they named after their lost parents, a tribute to the past, a symbol of hope for the future. Enzo found solace in his music, playing the piano, composing melodies that reflected the beauty of their new life, the peace he had found, the love he shared with Caterina. He no longer carried the burden of revenge, the weight of responsibility, the darkness that had once consumed him. He was free, liberated, a man transformed by love. Caterina found fulfillment in her writing, penning stories that spoke of resilience, of courage, of the enduring power of the human spirit. She wrote of her past, of the challenges she had overcome, of the love she had found, but she did so anonymously, protecting their privacy, shielding their children from the shadows of their former lives. They never forgot the past, the lessons they had learned, the sacrifices they had made, but they did not dwell on it. They focused on the present, on their love, on their family, on the future they were building together. They occasionally received news from Italy, whispers of the changes that had taken place, of the dismantling of the old mafia families, of the rise of a new generation, a generation that sought to break free from the cycle of violence, to build a better future. Detective Rossi, now retired, remained a friend, a confidant, a reminder of the justice they had fought for, the victory they had achieved. He visited them occasionally, sharing stories, exchanging memories, a bond forged in the crucible of conflict. Isabella, having fully recovered, rebuilt her life, finding love and happiness far from the influence of her family, far from the darkness that had once threatened to consume her. She remained in contact with Caterina, their bond strengthened by the shared trauma, the mutual support, the enduring power of family. One evening, as the sun set over the ocean, casting a golden glow over their peaceful home, Caterina and Enzo sat on their porch, watching their children play in the garden, their laughter echoing through the air, a symphony of joy, of innocence, of a future filled with hope. Enzo reached for Katerina's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, their touch of familiar comfort, a silent language of love. "We did it, Katerina," he said, his voice soft, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "We made it." Katerina smiled, her heart overflowing with gratitude, with happiness, with a love that had endured the test of time, the trials of adversity, the darkness of their past. "Yes," she said, her voice equally soft, her gaze meeting his. "We did." They sat there, in silence, their hands clasped together, their bodies close, their hearts intertwined. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple, a breathtaking spectacle of beauty, of peace, of a love that had conquered all. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale, but in the real world, a world that had been filled with darkness, with violence, with betrayal. They had forged their own destiny, their own future, their own love story, a story that would be told for generations to come, a story of resilience, of courage, of the enduring power of the human spirit. A story, ultimately, of love. The love between a reluctant bride and the mafia don who stole her, and changed both of their lives forever. The end.